Our second reading this morning comes from the book of Revelation, chapter 7, verses 9 through 17. After this I looked, and there was a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, from all tribes and peoples and languages, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, robed in white, with palm branches in their hands. They cried out in a loud voice, saying, "Salvation belongs to our God who is seated on the throne and to the Lamb." And all the angels stood around the throne and around the elders and the four living creatures, and they fell on their faces before the throne and worshiped God, singing, "Amen. Blessing and glory and wisdom and thanksgiving and honor and power and might be to our God forever and ever. Amen." Then one of the elders addressed me, saying, "Who are these robed in white, and where have they come from?" I said to him, "Sir, you are the one that knows." Then he said to me, "These are they who have come out of the great ordeal. They have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. For this reason they are before the throne of God, and worship him day and night within his temple, and the one who is seated on the throne will shelter them. They will hunger no more and thirst no more. The sun will not strike them, nor any scorching heat. For the Lamb at the center of the throne will be their shepherd, and he will guide them to springs of the water of life. And God will wipe away every tear from their eyes." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. In an otherwise normal and mundane diary, there is this entry about the city of Lisbon on All Saints' Day in 1755. "There never was a finer morning scene than the 1st of November. The sun shone out in its full luster. The whole face of the sky was perfectly serene and clear, and not the least signal of warning of that approaching event, which has made this once flourishing, opulent, and populous city a scene of the utmost horror and desolation." That horror and desolation arrived just a few minutes after 9:30 in the morning. Lisbon was one of the most pious cities in Europe at the time, and the vast majority of the population was in church to celebrate the festival of All Saints' Day. At 9:30, a massive earthquake seized the ocean floor about 60 miles off the coast of Lisbon in the Atlantic. In Lisbon, that first quake caused cathedral bell towers to sway and set the bells to clanging wildly. Terrified worshipers were sprayed with glass from exploding windows and saw lit candles fall to the floor, starting a series of fires that would add to the destruction. With the second wave of the earthquake, churches, homes, and government buildings collapsed, killing thousands and injuring more, and sending up clouds of dust that turned the sky black. When the third shockwave hit, there was virtually nothing left to be destroyed. Thousands of survivors had made their way to the harbor in hopes of escaping the devastation by ship. They arrived there just in time to see the water in the harbor sucked out to sea and then return in the form of a massive tsunami. Earthquake, fire, flood. What happened in Lisbon that day was exactly the kind of apocalyptic disaster most of us associate with the book of Revelation. That is, if we associate this book with anything at all. For those of us firmly rooted in mainline Christianity, this book may not be a place we have spent a lot of time. The imagery is vivid, scary, and often confusing. Perhaps because of that, it's also the book of the Bible that has probably been most interpreted by pop culture in books, movies, even radio shows. and usually not in a way that helps us to understand it better. So it always surprises me to return to passages of Revelation like the one we just heard, and remember that this book was not written to frighten people. It was written to comfort them. Before Revelation was a book in the Bible, it was a letter written to a group of early churches. And before it was a letter, it was a vision seen by a man named John. After his vision, John wrote down what he saw and sent this letter to Christian communities in what is now Turkey. These churches were trying to figure out how to faithfully follow Christ, while at the same time be active members of their secular society. Like all the faithful before and after them, the people in these churches were dealing with profound change, an uncertain future, the loss of loved ones, and all the challenges that come with committing to a life of faith. For most of us, this All Saints' Day is a time when we reflect on the people in our lives we have loved and lost. Parents or grandparents, siblings or partners, friends or teachers. It's a time we remember the people who touched our lives, who shaped us into who we are today. But remembering these people means grieving their loss all over again. And this has a way of causing us to reflect on all the loss we have known, not just through death, but through broken relationships, failed endeavors, entrenched addiction, ruined dreams. Some years ago, when the Presbyterian minister turned children's entertainer Fred Rogers received a special Emmy for his work, he got up to give a speech. Before he started talking, though, he asked everyone in the room to observe 30 seconds of silence, during which he asked them to remember those whose sacrifices enabled them to be where they are today. After 30 seconds, the only sound in the room was quiet sniffling and rustling as people reached for tissues to dry their eyes. As we take time today to remember both who we have lost and what we have lost, we are left longing for the kind of healing and comfort this text describes. No more hunger, no more thirst, no more discomfort, and a God so intimate with us that God wipes every tear from our eyes. Writing about the death of his mother after a long illness, Tom Long recalls how every day in hospice care, she would beckon one of the loved ones who kept vigil at her bedside and whisper the words, "I'm hungry." She had a feeding tube, and she was getting as much broth and pureed food as her dying body could handle, but still she kept telling them day after day, "I'm hungry." The hospice staff assured the family that her body could not feel hunger pains, but still, of course, it upset them. One day, Tom entered the room and found her restless in bed. "What's wrong?" he asked. "Are you hungry?" "Very," she whispered. Tom felt helpless. He didn't know what to do. He tried to give her some soft food, but after a couple of bites, she shook her head. "No more." "Slowly, it dawned on me," he writes. "I'm hungry" was her way of describing the totality of her circumstance. She was not asking for food. She was saying that everything was slipping away. Her personal history was closing down, coming to an end. Her days of breath and food and light and family and the touch of love were ebbing, and she was hungry. Hungry for more, hungry for the life being taken away from her, very hungry. Revelation offers us a vision of what awaits us on the other side of the grief and loss that so often weighs us down. It's a vision that attempts to feed the deep hunger within us all. Just who are all these people standing around God's throne, John asks in his vision. The answer? They are the ones who have come through the great ordeal of life. A life of faith is not about perfection. To be a saint does not mean that we must have such extraordinary faith that we are set apart from the average Christian. A saint is exactly what is described here, a person, any person, who has persevered through the ordeal of life and walked with God on this journey of faith. A saint is not someone whose life has been seized by God and used for God's own purposes. A saint is one who has worked with God, wrestled with God, even partnered with God in our own salvation. Notice that each person in this great multitude has washed their own robes in the blood of the Lamb. God has not done the hard work of faith for them. They have participated in it themselves. For this reason, the text says, for this reason, they are now before the throne of God and worship God day and night, and the one who is seated on the throne will shelter them. In the midst of the Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther identified what he called the marks of the church. Most of them are exactly the things we would expect: the Bible, the sacraments, worship. But he added one mark that might surprise us: suffering. For Martin Luther, where there is faith, there is suffering. After the horrific events in Lisbon on All Saints' Day in 1755, after the earthquake, fires, and flood, more and more theologians started to question the idea that suffering is a punishment from God. Up to this point, there had been a very linear understanding between the relationship of human suffering and of human behavior and the suffering that came from God. But after these events, which occurred in the midst of the Enlightenment, with all the scientific discoveries that came with it, theologians began to think differently about the meaning of suffering and pain. In response to a reader who claimed that religion cannot deal with doubt and dissent, the New York Times opinion writer Stanley Fish wrote, "What religion are you talking about? The religions I know are about nothing but doubt and dissent and the struggles of faith, the dark night of the soul, feelings of unworthiness, serial backsliding, the abyss of despair." He goes on, whether it is the Book of Job, the Confessions of St. Augustine, Calvin's Institutes, Bunyan's Grace Abounding to the Chief of Sinners, Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling, and 1,000 other texts, the religious life is depicted as one of aspiration within the conviction of frailty. The heart of that life is not a set of propositions about the world, although there is some of that, but an orientation toward perfection by a being that is radically imperfect. When we struggle, when we doubt, when we wonder whether God is there at all, that doesn't keep us from achieving sainthood. That simply means we are on the Christian journey. And John's vision before us today offers us a glimpse of where that journey will ultimately take us and all we love. The vision itself can't take away our pain. What it can do is give us hope. Hope for those who have gone before us and whose struggle is now over. Hope for ourselves as we wrestle with God on our journeys of faith. Last week, someone sent an email to the main church email address. The message contained just one question: what are your church's views on baptism and salvation? When this question landed in my inbox just as I was wrestling with this passage from Revelation, I realized that the answer is contained in these verses. This image here of a multitude of people from every nation and creed and language unified in their worship of God, that is an image of salvation, of God's love freely given to all the world. And although the baptismal imagery isn't explicit in this passage, it is present in the white robes that have been washed in the blood of the Lamb and in the living water the Lamb offers all. The waters of baptism symbolize death. In baptism, we die to ourselves and to all the identities we have claimed for ourselves, and we proclaim that the only identity that matters is that we are God's children, holy and beloved. Just as the blood of the Lamb paradoxically removes all the stains from those white robes, so the deadly waters of baptism offer us new life by returning us to our true core identity. Baptism proclaims and promises that we belong to God, always, no matter what. Maybe you noticed that our baptismal font occupies a more central place in worship today. That is intentional. For the font is a visible reminder that no matter what ordeals you face in your journey of faith, no matter what grief overwhelms you, no matter what waters threaten to flood your life, God is with you. In baptism, we proclaim this promise that God has claimed us. Before anything else, we are God's. God promises to be present with us on this journey and to bring us to this glorious scene that is depicted in John's vision that we heard today, a day when all people will unite in their worship of God, and when God will reach out and heal and comfort us once and for all. Amen.